Monday morning. What's up, everybody? I'm feeling pretty stressed out today, but it's all good. I got a little red box, and I got a microphone. That's how they made hip-hop, right? I think so. I'll get back to you on that. Today we're going to do something different. Something different. Let's do it. Certainly in the past, I went back and looked at other people's patches, and that's fun. But today I want to look at what I always think is the best patch I ever made right here. Living Grass 1. We're going to study it. Okay. So I don't claim that this is an original idea, but I remember studying in classical music that there was some musicians who used to go around and literally write down bird songs. Like they would collect bird songs and try to transcribe them, using a musical staff, like a piano recital type thing. And I don't remember what I was doing when I made this patch. This patch was probably made, it was definitely made over a decade ago. I would guess around 2005, 2004, something like that. So I'd heard of the classical music guys doing that. I also heard this story about a Japanese princess, and she was really eccentric, and she used to drag the whole court out in the spring or in the autumn to a field, and there would be bugs chirping and birds and frogs, and she would listen to it and be like, "It's a concert, don't you get it?" And all the guys in the court were like, okay. So the king was like, "Yeah, that princess is a little bit too eccentric to get married, so we're going to take her out of the line of succession because she likes listening to bug concerts too much." So anyway, that's what we have here today. We have a bug concert. Living Grass is supposed to suggest that these are virtual versions of swamp critters. The one that we're listening to right now is Glass Beetle. If you look at knob number 1 and then the 2 volume knobs, because he's in stereo, you can only hear Glass Beetle right now, that clicking sound. I'm just going to dial in the green and the blue knobs. First, let's hear the middle channel, which you can see here is labeled Metal Birds. There it is. It was being quiet for a second. So those are the metal birds. They're kind of quacking in a somewhat bird-like way. Finally, let's dial in the third voice, which is Hypnotoad. You can hear him ribbiting. So this was very much a successful patch for me. Is this music that you're listening to right now? I'll let you decide whether it is or isn't. It's an attempt to replicate a virtual swamp audio environment. I'm also really obsessed with this guy named Bernie Krause and the niche hypothesis. I'll post a PDF of that if you want to read about it later. He cares about he would do a lot of field recordings of animals and see how they were affected by humans. Anyway, I can't go into all Bernie Krause today. What I am going to do is analyze what each voice is doing. So let's dial the birds and the frogs back out, and we're back to just Glass Beetle. So first of all, we have each voice is arranged vertically, and they're in reverse order. They're starting here and going up, which is the opposite of the way I usually do things on this channel, but that's what I chose to do when I built this, so I haven't messed with it. So first of all, this one has a clock at 158 BPM, and he is clocking 2 random step generators. We turn on the blue wires as well. Those clocked random generators are affecting the modules in the audio chain. We'll talk about them in a sec. Let's take blue away again. So we can also see here that this very fast clock is running the event sequencer, and if you look at the lights, you'll see when it's triggered. But the event sequencer has not been set to loop mode, and it is 25 steps long. So it can be silent for an indeterminate period of time. There we just saw it trigger twice, and that's probably because of the reset button. The clock is set to reset, periodically. And the funny thing is that the clock itself is being reset by this, a random pulse generator. So I definitely wasn't trying to make a normal 4-on-the-floor clock. I wanted something that would trigger this little pattern, which is 1 and 1 and 4 hits and 1, and occasionally re-trigger it at odd times as the Beetle made his sounds. Although some of these buttons are depressed on the second channel, it's not connected to anything, so it doesn't matter. So this clock structure is actually similar to the other 2 clocks, so we'll see that in a second. So again, this is the whole clock area, and the modulation area is really this bottom part of the voice. And here's what you're hearing. So being triggered by the sequencer is a percussion oscillator. A percussion oscillator doesn't need an envelope or a VCA because he's already got those built in. This one has been set to be very clicky, but to have a very short decay, which is why it's so short. And its pitch is being drastically altered by the clocked random step generator. So it's going up and down, but those clicks are so short in terms of length that it's hard to really hear the changes in pitch. Well, you might hear it like this. If the decay is very long, that's what you get. But dial it down, and we're back to Glass Beetle again. He's also been set to punch, so he's trying to be a very clicky tone. First off, he's being sent into the digitizer. The quantizer is off, but the sample rate is being messed with by this control signal. And it's already set to have a pretty major reduction. So what I'm doing here is sample rate reduction, which I find incredibly useful in making lo-fi, low-bit sounds, or making digital more interesting and more crunchy. But it doesn't end there. Next it goes into a clipper, which is a kind of distortion. And finally it goes into this one. This is actually the high-low shelving EQ. So if you see here, you can switch how the shelf works, whether it's a high or a low. And here he's just boosting some high frequencies. So I guess when it came out of the audio processors, I decided to make it a bit more high-pitched because that's how a Beetle sounds, I guess, maybe. So that's this voice. Let's go to the next one. Dial the Beetle out and dial the birds in. What you might find surprising is that although the 3 sounds in the end are quite different, their creation process is quite similar. So, if anything, I would say is a lack of creativity on my part, but it doesn't matter really how you design your modules, it matters what sound comes out. So, if I was copying off myself, or whatever you want to call it, I wouldn't blame myself because I like the final result. So let's look down here. We got another clock, not quite as fast as the other one, but still pretty fast. And he is clocking the sequencer. The sequencer is doing a weird, irregular little pattern. Similar to this one, the looping has been turned off, and it's been set to 28 steps, so there's definitely periods of silence. And this clock, although it's hard to see, doesn't have a reset being fed to it. But this same guy here, who was feeding the reset of the first clock, is being sent to this logic delay, And after a brief delay, it's being sent to reset this sequencer. So again, the irregular patterns that are resetting and having indeterminate gaps in the middle is what I was going for, and it's what I got. I do have some modulation here. This is a sine wave LFO, but it's not being controlled by anything. It's just set to a fixed rate, and it's controlling a variety of parameters in this voice. As you see, it goes to the right. It's also controlling some of the pan. We can't hear the panning because we're in mono today. But yeah, we also whereas this one has 2 clocked random step generators, the LFO is independent of any clock in the second voice. And ditto for this one. This is a very slow random step generator, but he's not clocked, he's just random. And he's also feeding some of the third voice, and he's feeding the pan on the right, as you can see. And he's feeding the second voice as well. So again, 2 channels of modulation here, 2 channels here. We have a sequencer with a weird reset and a clock. And let's look at our audio voice. So whereas here we started with percussion oscillator, here we started with oscillator slave E1, which is a sine wave oscillator. This is certainly designed for FM. There's nothing in the FM input, but there is amplitude modulation from that LFO. So he's helping the wobbly or quacky effect with this patching here. The pitch is not being affected, but we're doing something similar here. Look at the settings on this digitizer. This one, the quantizer is off. This one, it's on, but it's pretty high at 12 bits. Lower than a CD, but still pretty high. And if you look here, this is a modulation for the sample rate, which is set at about a little before 3 o'clock. And here we have the sample rate at about 2 o'clock, which is also being modulated by a different source. But overall, the concept is similar. And then finally here we have an envelope. Well, we didn't need an envelope with the percussion oscillator, but the sine wave that we're getting here needs one, so we can speak. And that's why he's being triggered here by the sequencer. Again, a very, very short decay keeps all these little blips and bleeps short. Let's open this up. See, it's quite a weird, spacey sound. But if you dial it down to a reasonable number, you get the quacks I was going for. And finally, at the end here, we got a phaser, a very expensive, in terms of processing power, piece of hardware. If you've watched my videos before, you see I use it a hell of a lot. I actually have 2 phasers that a guy is building me from nonlinear circuits on the way to add to my hardware modular too. But that's another story. And you can see the knobs are really cranked here. The spread is at full, but the amount of modulation is at full. There's only one peak, and the center frequency is also being completely modulated as much as it possibly can. This is also helping the quackiness of the sound. If you don't, let me prove it. Turn it up a little bit. I'm going to grab the LFO speed and turn it down, and it should change things. See? Now we get more of like someone popping off the tops of virtual Coke bottles. But dial it up, and we get the quackiness again. There we go. Okay, so that was the second voice, and let's look at the third voice. Just dragging his clock area away. Already we can see he doesn't have as many parts in his clocking as the other guys do, but what he'll do is he'll leech off some of the signals they're already creating. So here's my same pattern again. Although I haven't adjusted the number of steps, you can see that we have a sequencer that's been set to not loop. And this guy didn't even bother with... Oh, wait, did he? Looks like he did. He took the same clock as number 1, but he has a different resetter than number 1, so that we don't line up the frogs and the Beatles too identically. That just wouldn't do. But yeah, you can see him powering through the sequence super fast here as the green lights flash through quickly. Oh, we should be listening to that voice. There we go. That's the frogs. He really does sound, he's almost the most realistic. The birds are a little bird-like, and beetles aren't really made out of glass and they don't really make sounds. But I mean, bugs make sounds. But Hypnotoad is pretty toad-like, if you ask me. So let's look at how we got there. We have the formant oscillator, which is unique to the Nord Modular, or, well, you rarely see formant oscillators. I bet you could do it with braids in the modern world. And he's being modulated by, he's leeching off this control voltage from here, just to save processing power. Notice that this whole mix is at 87.2, so he is trying to save some power. And the timbre is being adjusted by that random setting, but he also has two sources of random pitch control, certainly nothing tuned. They're just slightly open here, but they're coming from two different one clocked to one unclocked random step generator. So the pitch that's coming out of here is odd, and the timbre is also quite varied. Then he goes into an envelope, which has an even shorter decay. I thought this guy was short. He was in the 50s. This guy has a decay of 28 milliseconds, so he's pretty darn short. So again, if you look here, the sequencer is really ripping. Every time he goes ribbit, is just one whole cycle through. So he's actually triggering this sound a heck of a lot of times. So let's hear what we get if we do this. Something quite weird. Almost sounds like a metal slinky. Yeah, it's weird. Let's go back. I think it was 28, I said. Anyway, so did we notice, for example, that there's no filter being involved here in any way? There's no filter in the whole patch. Instead, the sound manipulation is coming from the timbre and also from the audio modules. So first up, as soon as we come out of the envelope, we got another digitizer. This is like a Frank or Father Moo trademark. Although his sample rate is a lot higher here than these guys at 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock. So it's a little bit cleaner, and the quantizer is off. That's also how I usually set it up, and it has a little bit of modulation from there. Next, instead of using the clipper like the first voice, we're using Wave Wrapper, which is an interesting choice to put with formant oscillator. Its amount of wrapping is set very low, but there's still modulation going in here and helping to get that brittle digital tone. And finally, I think this is quite an important part of the sound. Another phaser with pretty heavy modulation, whereas this one had the least number of peaks, 1. This one has 6, and the feedback is also cranked up. So I think in some ways you could probably argue, especially if you were a better music scientist than Father Moo is, you could probably argue that this is acting like a comb filter, which again used to be rare. Nowadays you can see them in hardware synths. You can see them in hardware modular. So that's the 3 voices. Let's dial them all back in again. Hear the whole happy family. Finally, at the end here, this voice is going into a chorus module, whereas the other voices go into pan modules. And all 3 of those went in mono and came out stereo. And then they were mapped to left and right mixers. And their knobs were, put under the control of the knobs for their volume level. There's nothing else. You don't see any other red or green or blue knobs here because there's no mapping. All they do is volume. And finally, being sent out to the left and right channel. So that's pretty much all I have to say about this one. I feel happy with it. I feel it was usable. I would often, if I was doing a live performance, this is a patch I could definitely drop into almost anything because it doesn't really have a musical pitch or tone. And even if the audience doesn't pick up on the fact that I'm imitating a digital swamp, I don't really mind because I find the sounds interesting by themselves. You can also definitely drop this one into an effect like reverb or delay, and it will sound awesome. It will also sound a lot better in stereo than you're hearing today, but that's the way it goes. So, yeah, I like this one a lot. I use it a lot. It's in a ton of my music. And I was thinking of putting together a couple of tracks using the patches we've built here in the stream, so we could see them like in action, or how are they actually musically useful, if at all. And this guy will probably be showing up. He'll be the one blast from the past making his appearance. So again, in ambient music, they might often use field recordings or other sources for, nature sounds, but I encourage you to make your own nature sounds. They don't have to sound real to sound cool, especially on a digital synth that gives you a lot of flexibility. And if there's other environments you can replicate, I think I played a patch here before that was called the Steam Room or something like that, and it's supposed to sound like the engine room of a starship. At least that's how I perceived it. So yeah, what other environments can you emulate using your modular? It's a great question. Sit and listen to the sounds you hear around you and say to yourself, how can I imitate this? How can I reproduce this? Even if you don't get all the way there that it sounds like a sampler, it doesn't matter. This is synthesis, is just trying to get to the sounds or suggesting the sounds is often more interesting than just recording them and playing them back. So yeah, it's been another lovely Sunday. Great to see you all again. We'll be back with a new patch from scratch, but I am going to drop this one into the archive, just because I'm not going to do this very much. I like the strategy of building new patches every time. It's certainly helping me, but at least for this one, I feel I talked about it, I explained it, and I want to share it with everybody. So there's Living Grass 1, number 33 in our archive, and drop it in the synth. Oh, actually, yeah, there we go. Some of the patches are out of order, but it's no big deal. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll be back again soon. Father Moo out.